My name is Asia Bear, and I'll be presenting Chapter 1 of the New Jim Crow, The Rebirth of Caste, the cultivation of hate as a tool by the elite. I will attempt to show in this presentation how the elite uses hate, racial hate, to divide blacks and whites. Before slavery, labor consisted of black and white bondsmen. Indentured servitude provided cheap labor. At this time, race was not an issue. In the quest for free labor, plantation owners or planter elite had three options. Native Americans, who were seen as savages at this time, which made it easier and morally right for whites to take over their land. However, they weren't seen as good options for free labor because they could fight back. Poor whites were another option, but this wasn't a viable option either because they didn't want to use whites as slave labor because they didn't want to impede voluntary immigration to the United States of America. Well, America. So Africans were the best option because they were seen as powerless, especially once they were brought over to America. And thus Africans began to be used as slave labor. During Bacon's Rebellion of 1675, Nathaniel Bacon tried to unite other landowners to fight against the Native Americans for more land. When those landowners declined to help him, he united black and white bondsmen together against the elite. They attacked, but the rebellion ended in force, by force and promises of amnesty. However, many of the participants were hung. Slavery. Bacon's rebellion gave rise to concerns over black and white unity. So blacks became the new savages, and more slaves were brought over from Africa and in larger quantities. Whites were given special privileges, such as jobs as overseers and the ability to own land, and thus birthed the white supremacy ideal. Was able to flourish for the 400 years that slavery took place. The death of slavery. The end of slavery left the South in disarray. There was a question of what to do with black people. White people were afraid that the blacks were going to retaliate. Also, a lot of states were left destitute because of the financial burdens of civil war, and a lot of property was damaged. So black codes and laws were introduced as a means of controlling the free blacks. So blacks began to be arrested for unemployment, vagrancy, and other laws that were enacted as a means to lock free blacks up. And slavery was essentially renewed because that prison labor was able to be hired out to plantation owners. And the 13th Amendment made it legal to do this. After slavery is known as the Reconstruction era. During this time, there was lots of legislation that was introduced to aid black people in assimilation to society. So you had the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which established full citizenship to black people. You had the 14th Amendment, which provided due process and equal rights to all citizens. The 15th Amendment gave blacks the right to vote. The Ku Klux Klan Acts made interference with voting and violent infringement of civil rights a crime. The Freedmen's Bureau was established to aid free blacks with food, clothing, fuel, and other assistance. Public education was also made available to blacks, and white people benefited from this as well. Despite these improvements, blacks were segregated from white society in the South and in the North. Of redemption, white violence, and government abandonment. These improvements for free black people angered white people, and white violence began to prevail. Outraged Southern whites and the Ku Klux Klan lashed out against the government and elected officials. This eventually caused the government to pull back assistance. The Freedmen's Bureau became defunct at this time, and vagrancy and other laws like mischief and insulting gestures were enforced harshly against black people. And they were hit with court costs and fines and subject to arrest, which made it so that even more black people were locked up and used for slave labor. Relations. After slavery, segregation laws hadn't officially been enacted, and new schools of political thought were introduced in the South. So you had liberalism, which preached that the government was hypocritical because they did not offer free and equal rights to everyone. This was a Northern philosophy, and it didn't gain much traction in the South. Then you had conservatism, which blamed liberals for pushing blacks too far, too fast, and warned black people that the redeemers or angry whites were preparing for war against them. And this did gain some black support. Then you had radicalism and populism, which pitted the poor against the wealthy. It preached racial hate as a weapon used by the wealthy to divide the poor and remove the strength of their numbers. And this did gain significant support and success among blacks and whites. And anytime blacks and whites began to unite, the elite would enact laws or propose legislation or thoughts to divide them, and thus were the segregation laws. Death of Jim Crow and the Second Reconstruction. This is the Civil Rights Movement era. The Civil Rights Movement was started in response to segregation laws. During this time, you had Brown versus Board of Education, which ended separate but equal. The NAACP had many legal successes. Smith v. All White ended the use of all white primary elections. Southern whites were enraged and responded by enacting more Jim Crow